February 1944, the Indian Ocean. A Japanese submarine commander surfaces his boat after a successful attack. He has just sunk a British troop ship carrying over 300 souls, nurses, soldiers, sailors, the largest single loss of British service women in the entire war. He expects to slip away into the darkness. Japanese submarines have been doing exactly that for 2 years in these waters. Attack, submerge, vanish. The British lack the ships to hunt them properly. The Indian Ocean is too vast, the escorts too few. But 2 British destroyers are turning toward him. HMS Patid and HMS Paladin. And these destroyers will not stop. For the next 30 hours, through daylight and darkness, through depth charge attacks and desperate evasion, through mechanical failures and dwindling ammunition, the British will hunt this submarine until one side or the other is destroyed. Post-war interrogations of Japanese submarine officers revealed something unexpected. When asked what they feared most about Allied anti-submarine warfare, they did not say aircraft. They did not say radar. They did not say the sheer number of American ships. They said persistence. And no engagement in the entire Pacific War demonstrated British persistence more completely than what happened on February 12, 1944. This is the story of why Japanese submariners learned to fear British destroyers more than anything else in the Indian Ocean. The Japanese Submarine 27 was one of the most formidable boats operating from the Penang base in Malaya. A Type B-1 fleet submarine, she represented the best of Imperial Japanese Navy submarine design. Displacement reached 2,631 tons submerged. Length stretched to 108 m, beam measured 9.3 m. These were large submarines by any standard, larger than most German Hubert, designed for the vast distances of Pacific operations. Her armament was substantial. 6 21-inch torpedo tubes forward could launch the fearsome Type 95 torpedo, which carried a warhead of 405 kilograms of explosive. She carried 17 torpedoes in total, enough for multiple attacks across a long patrol. A 140mm deck gun provided surface firepower. Twin 25mm anti-aircraft mounts offered some protection against aircraft. Crew complement was 94 officers and men. Propulsion came from 2 diesel engines producing 12,400 horsepower for surface running, giving a maximum speed of 23.5 knots. Submerged, electric motors delivered 2,000 horsepower for a speed of 8 knots. Range on the surface reached 14,000 nautical miles at 16 knots, allowing patrols lasting months across the Indian Ocean's vast expanses. Her commander was Commander Toshioki Fukumura, an experienced officer who had already conducted multiple patrols in the Indian Ocean. Under his command, I-27 had sunk several Allied merchant ships. She had also committed documented war crimes, machine gunning survivors in the water after torpedo attacks. By early 1944, the Japanese submarine campaign in the Indian Ocean had achieved significant success. Since 1942, Japanese boats operating from Penang had sunk over 100 Allied merchant vessels, tankers carrying fuel from the Persian Gulf, freighters laden with war material, troop ships moving reinforcements to India and Burma. The Indian Ocean was Britain's vulnerable flank. The strategic importance of these waters cannot be overstated. Convoys carrying troops and supplies to Burma, to India, to the Middle East all had to pass through waters where Japanese submarines hunted virtually unopposed. The 14th Army fighting in Burma depended on supplies shipped through Kolkata and Chittagong. The forces in India relied on reinforcements arriving by sea from Britain, Africa, and Australia. The entire Eastern strategy hinged on keeping these sea lanes open. The problem was simple and seemingly insurmountable. Britain could not spare enough escorts. The Battle of the Atlantic demanded everything the Royal Navy had. At its peak, hundreds of escorts protected convoys crossing the North Atlantic. The Mediterranean required constant protection for the supply lines to Malta, North Africa, and eventually Italy. What remained for the Indian Ocean was a handful of aging destroyers, some sloops, a few corvettes, never enough to properly protect the vast convoy routes stretching from Aden to Colombo to Kolkata. The distances were staggering. From Mombasa to Colombo stretched over 2,000 nautical miles. From Colombo to Kolkata added another 1,200. A convoy traveling at 8 knots might take weeks to complete the passage. Escorts could not remain with convoys for the entire journey. Fuel limitations, crew exhaustion, and the need to protect multiple convoys simultaneously forced constant rotation. Japanese submarine commanders knew this. They operated with near impunity. Attack a convoy. Submerge. Wait for the escorts to give up the hunt after a few hours, then surface and continue the patrol. British persistence in the Atlantic was legendary. British persistence in the Indian Ocean was constrained by mathematics. Too few ships, too much ocean. I-27 departed Penang on January 26, 1944. Her patrol area was the western Indian Ocean near the Maldives. Intelligence suggested heavy convoy traffic in that region. Fukumura intended to intercept whatever he could find. Convoy KR-8 departed Kilindini, the port serving Mombasa in Kenya on February 5, 1944. 5 troop ships carrying military personnel to Ceylon and onward to Burma. Among them was the SS Cardiff Ismail, an Egyptian-registered liner of 7,513 gross tons built in 1922, requisitioned for war service as a troop ship. Aboard Cardiff Ismail were 1,324 people, military personnel heading to the Burma front, naval ratings, and 77 members of the Women's Royal Naval Service, WINS personnel assigned to signals and communications duties in Ceylon. The convoy's escort was thin. The cruiser HMS Hawkins served as the main protection. An aging Hawkins-class heavy cruiser dating from 1919. 2 destroyers accompanied her. HMS Pathet Pennant No. G56 and HMS Paladin Pennant No. G69. Both were P-class destroyers completed in 1942 as part of the Emergency War Construction Program. The P-class represented capable but not exceptional design. 1840 tons full load displacement. 345 feet long overall, beam of 35 feet, draft of 13 feet loaded. Propulsion came from 2 Admiral T3 drum boilers feeding Parsons geared turbines producing 40,000 shaft horsepower. Maximum speed reached 36.75 knots in trials, though operational conditions typically allowed somewhat less. Main armament consisted of 4.47 in Mark 9 guns and single mounts capable of engaging both surface and air targets. Close-range weapons included 1 quadruple 2-pounder pom-pom mount, 4 20mm Ericon cannon in single mounts and 4.5 in torpedo tubes in a single quadruple mounting. But for anti-submarine work, the critical systems were the depth charges and detection equipment. Each P-class destroyer carried up to 120 depth charges with 2 stern racks and 4 throwers. The Type 144 AIC set provided detection capability to 2,500 yards in favorable conditions. This was the same equipment fitted to escorts throughout the fleet, proven effective against German U-boat in the Atlantic. Compared to Japanese fleet submarines, the destroyers held advantages in speed and detection capability. I-27's submerged speed of 8 knots could not outrun a destroyer making 36. Her only hope was evasion through depth changes, course alterations, and waiting for the hunters to give up. Against most opponents, this strategy worked. HMS Pathet had already distinguished herself earlier in the war. In October 1942, she had forced the German submarine U-559 to the surface in the Mediterranean. Her crew had boarded the stricken U-boat and recovered Enigma code books, a capture that contributed significantly to breaking German naval codes. Lieutenant Anthony Faison and able seaman Colin Grasset had given their lives in that action, both awarded George Crosses. Now Petard was in the Indian Ocean under Commander Donovan Hall RP. Paladin was commanded by Lieutenant Commander John Harper Gower. Both ships were veterans. Both crews were experienced, but they were only 2 destroyers protecting 5 troop ships across hundreds of miles of ocean. On February 12, 1944, Convoy KR-8 was approximately 280 miles east of the Maldives. The morning watch had begun. Lookouts scanned the horizon. The sea was calm, visibility excellent. At 0742 hours, Cardiff Ismail exploded. 2 torpedoes from a 27 struck the troop ship almost simultaneously. The first hit forward, the second amidships. The explosions were catastrophic. Cardiff Ismail began sinking immediately. She would be gone in less than 2 minutes. Survivors described utter chaos. The ship listing violently within seconds of the torpedo impacts. Decks awash before lifeboats could be launched. Men and women thrown into the oil-covered water. The explosions had destroyed the ship's internal structure so quickly that there was no time for orderly evacuation. The 77 WINS personnel had almost no chance. Most were below decks when the torpedoes struck, in their quarters or at their duty stations. The rapid flooding and the ship's violent list trapped many before they could reach topside. Those who made it to the deck faced the chaos of a sinking ship, oil spreading across the water, and the confusion of hundreds of people trying to survive. Of the 77 women aboard, only 6 survived. The dead included cipher specialists, communications operators, and administrative personnel. Young women who had volunteered for overseas service to free men for combat duties. Some were barely out of their teens. Others were experienced professionals who had served throughout the war. All died in minutes, victims of a submarine attack they never saw coming. Total losses from Cardivism reached 1,297 dead. It remains the largest single loss of British service women in any incident during the Second World War. The disaster would become a footnote in most histories, overshadowed by the larger campaigns in Europe and the Pacific. But for the survivors and for the families who lost daughters, sisters, and friends, it was a catastrophe that demanded justice. On the bridge of HMS Patet, Commander RP had seconds to make a decision. The convoy was scattering as ordered. Survivors were in the water, and somewhere beneath the surface, a Japanese submarine was preparing to escape. Standard procedure would have been to remain with the convoy, protect the remaining ships, let another vessel conduct rescue operations. One submarine could not be allowed to draw off the escorts and leave the convoy vulnerable to a second attack. But RP made a different calculation. He had seen where the torpedoes came from. He knew roughly where the submarine had to be. And he knew something else. If this submarine escaped, it would continue hunting. More ships would die. More convoys would be attacked. Petard and Paladin turned toward the attack position. The hunt was on. Paladin was ordered to remain behind and conduct rescue operations. This was the humane choice. Survivors were dying in the water, but it also meant that Petard would hunt alone, at least initially. Root pushed his ship to maximum speed, 36 knots. The P-class destroyers were fast, but they burned fuel at a tremendous rate at full power. He was already calculating how long he could sustain the chase. Petard's AIC operator began searching. The Type 144 sonar could detect submarines at ranges up to 2,500 yards in good conditions. But the Indian Ocean was thermally complex. Temperature layers could hide a submarine completely. The equipment was good, but not infallible. I-27 was running deep. Fukumura knew the drill. Go deep. Go silent. Wait for the hunting ship to give up. In his experience, British escorts in the Indian Ocean searched for an hour, perhaps two, then returned to their convoys. The ocean was simply too vast for prolonged hunts. But at 0815, Patet gained contact. The ASDIC operator reported a firm return bearing 235 degrees range 1,800 yards. RP altered course immediately, bringing Patet's bow directly toward the target. The first depth charge attack went down at 0822. A pattern of 10 charges set to various depths from 150 feet to 300 feet. The ocean erupted behind Patet. Columns of white water shot skyward. The ship shuddered from the nearby explosions. Men braced against bulkheads as the concussions rolled through the hull. No result. The ASDIC operator reported the contact still moving, bearing shifting. I-27 had evaded. RP ordered another attack run. Petard circled, regained contact, accelerated to attack speed. More depth charges went down. The pattern spread across the submarine's estimated position. Each charge contained between 130 and 300 pounds of Torpex explosive, depending on the type. A direct hit or very near miss would crack a submarine's pressure hull. Even distant explosions could damage equipment, rupture pipes, terrify crews, and another run and another. For the next 3 hours, Patet conducted repeated depth charge attacks. Each time, the ASDIC team regained contact. Each time, charges went down. Each time the submarine escaped destruction but could not break free. By 1100 hours, Patet had expended significant ammunition. Over 60 depth charges had been dropped, but the contact remained. Fukumura could not shake the British destroyer. This was new. Japanese submarine commanders had grown accustomed to brief, half-hearted searches. What they were experiencing now was something different. This British captain was not leaving. At noon, Paladin rejoined the hunt. She had recovered what survivors she could from Cardiff Ismail. Now both destroyers would work together. The tactic shifted. Patet would maintain contact while Paladin prepared attack runs. The classic hunter-killer approach that had proven so effective against Hubert in the Atlantic. One ship holds the submarine in its ASDIC beam. The other runs in at speed and drops charges on the precise location. I-27 was deep. Estimates placed her at 250 feet or more. Fukumura was conserving his battery, moving as slowly as possible, hoping the destroyers would run low on fuel or ammunition and break off. The destroyers did not break off. Through the afternoon, attack after attack went down. The submarine twisted, turned, changed depth, changed course. Every trick in the Japanese manual, none of it worked. The British ASIC operators held contact with remarkable persistence. Here is what made British anti-submarine warfare different. The crews were trained specifically for this kind of extended hunt. In the Atlantic, they had learned that a submarine which escaped once would kill again. The only solution was absolute persistence. Never let go. Never break off. Hunt until the target was destroyed or had escaped beyond any possibility of relocation. This doctrine had evolved over years of bitter experience. Early in the war, British escorts routinely lost contacts after initial attacks. German Hubert exploited this predictability. By 1943 and 44, the Royal Navy had developed a culture of relentless pursuit. Hours meant nothing. Days meant nothing. Only results mattered. Fukumura did not understand this. He expected the destroyers to leave. They did not leave. If you're finding this deep dive interesting, consider subscribing. It supports the channel and helps bring more stories like this one. By late afternoon, I-27 had been submerged for nearly 9 hours. Her batteries were draining. Each maneuver, each burst of speed to evade an attack pattern consumed precious electrical power. The air was thickening. Carbon dioxide levels were rising as 94 men breathed in a sealed metal tube. Oxygen generators could only do so much. The scrubbers were working beyond their designed capacity. Temperature inside the submarine was climbing. The Indian Ocean waters were warm even at depth, and the constant maneuvering generated heat from the electric motors. Men sweated at their stations. Some were becoming dizzy. The ship's doctor moved through the compartments, checking on sailors who had begun to show signs of oxygen deprivation. And still, the British destroyers circled overhead, their ASDIC pinging relentlessly, their depth charges periodically shaking the hull. Every explosion brought new damage. Small leaks appeared in pipe fittings. Instruments were jarred loose from their mounts. The submarine steel groaned with each nearby detonation. Fukumura faced an ugly choice. Remain submerged until the batteries died completely, then surface helplessly in front of 2 enemy destroyers, or attempt to run on the surface where his higher speed might allow escape, but where he would be completely vulnerable to gunfire. He chose a third option: wait for darkness. As the sun set on February 12, the hunt continued. Petard and Paladin took turns maintaining contact. Their ASIC operators worked in shifts, ears pressed to headphones, tracking the faint returns from the submarine below. Fukumura waited. In darkness, he might be able to surface, recharge his batteries, and slip away. Japanese submarines had done it before. The Indian Ocean night was vast and black. 2 destroyers could not cover every direction. At approximately 2,100 hours, I-27 surfaced. The darkness Fukumura hoped would conceal him offered no protection. The destroyer crews were watching with night glasses and radar. The moment E-27's conning tower broke the surface, HMS Petard's lookout spotted the telltale silhouette against the faint starlight. Starshell illumination rounds turned night into day. The 4.7 guns fired illumination shells that burst overhead, casting harsh white light across the ocean surface. Both ships opened fire with their 4.7 guns. Tracer rounds streaked across the water. The pom-poms joined in, their distinctive rhythm hammering through the night air. 20mm Ericans added streams of fire. I-27 crash-dived. But the British had her position exactly marked. The few seconds of exposure had been enough. Before she could reach safety depth, a pattern of depth charges detonated directly overhead. The submarine was still relatively shallow when the explosions bracketed her position. The submarine staggered. Water sprayed into compartments through damaged seals. Emergency parties rushed to plug leaks. Electricians scrambled to isolate damaged circuits before seawater could cause short circuits or fires. Damage unknown severity. But she was still moving. Fukumura went deeper than before. 275 feet 290. The hull groaned under the pressure. Japanese fleet submarines were rated for depths of 100 m, approximately 330 feet. Going deeper risked structural failure, but staying shallow meant certain death. Above, the destroyers regained contact and resumed the hunt. Through the night of February 12 into the morning of February 13, the pursuit continued. Both destroyer crews were exhausted. They had been at action stations for nearly 24 hours, coffee and sandwiches eaten at weapon stations, no sleep, eyes burning from staring at instruments and scanning dark waters. But they did not stop. Rupen Gower drove their crews through pure determination. The women on Khadiva Ismail, the soldiers, the sailors, every death demanded an answer. I-27 was in serious trouble. The damage from the depth charge attacks had caused flooding in several compartments. Her batteries were nearly exhausted. The crew was suffering from oxygen depletion and carbon dioxide buildup. Men were becoming sluggish, their thinking impaired. At approximately 0600 on February 13, nearly 22 hours after the hunt began, I-27 surfaced again. She had no choice. Remain submerged and die slowly of asphyxiation as the air turned to poison, or surface and fight. Fukumura chose to fight. It was his only remaining option. The submarine's deck gun opened fire on the approaching destroyers before the boat was even fully surfaced. Her anti-aircraft weapons joined in, spraying 25mm shells toward the British ships. Japanese sailors scrambled onto the wet heaving deck to man the weapons. After nearly a day submerged in foul air, the fresh ocean breeze must have felt like paradise. A paradise that would last only minutes. Patton and Paladin returned fire with everything they had. 4, 7-inch guns belched flame. Pom-poms hammered rapid bursts. Ehrlichens traced bright lines through the pre-dawn darkness. Shell splashes erupted around A-27. Direct hits sparked against her conning tower. The submarine took multiple hits. Her conning tower was struck. The steel plating buckled by 4, 7 in high explosive shells. Her hull was hauled above the waterline in several places. Smoke poured from at least one compartment, but she was still firing back, still trying to either drive off the destroyers or score a lucky hit that might allow escape. A single torpedo from A-27 could sink either destroyer. Both captains knew this. They pressed the attack regardless. Patton closed the range. 300 yards, 200 Y. This was knife-fighting distance for naval warfare. At this range, misses were unlikely, but so was survival if the submarine managed to launch torpedoes. Commander RP made a decision that would become legendary in Royal Navy histories. At approximately 0700 hours on February 13, 1944, HMS Patton rammed A-27. The collision was deliberate. RP aimed his destroyer directly at the submarine and ordered full ahead. 1,800 tons of British destroyer struck the submarine midship at speed. The impact was tremendous. Petard's bow crumpled like paper. I-27's pressure hull, already weakened by hours of depth charging, collapsed under the blow. The submarine began sinking immediately. Men spilled into the water from her deck. Her guns fell silent. The boat rolled, showing her keel for a moment, then slid beneath the waves, stern first. Petard herself was damaged in the collision. Her bow was stoved in, compartments flooded, watertight doors holding back the sea, but she remained afloat. Damaged control parties worked desperately to shore up bulkheads and contain the flooding. As I-27 slipped beneath the waves, both destroyers dropped additional depth charges on the position. No chances taken, no possibility of survival allowed. The explosion sent geysers of water skyward, marking the grave of the submarine and her crew. The hunt had lasted approximately 30 hours. I-27 was destroyed. All 94 of her crew perished. Commander Fukumura died with his boat. The sinking of the 27 was not merely a tactical success. It demonstrated something that Japanese submarine command had not fully appreciated. British destroyers in the Indian Ocean would not stop. Post-war interrogations of Japanese naval officers provide direct testimony about this factor. Vice Admiral Miwa Shigeyoshi, director of the Naval Submarine Department and commander-in-chief of the 6th Submarine Fleet, was interrogated in October 1945 as part of the United States Strategic Bombing Survey. When asked about Allied anti-submarine effectiveness, Miwa stated that Japanese submariners feared British persistence above almost every other factor. His exact words described how Allied ships were remarkably persistent around Japanese submarines. Once contact was gained, it was rarely broken off. This stood in sharp contrast to earlier Japanese experience. In 1942 and early 1943, Allied escorts in the Indian Ocean typically conducted brief searches before returning to convoy protection duties. Japanese submarines exploited this predictability, attack, evade for a few hours, resume patrol. The destruction of the 27 showed that the rules had changed. The British would now hunt to the death. The impact on Japanese submarine operations was significant. Standing orders were issued requiring submarines to exercise extreme caution when attacking escorted convoys. Commanders were instructed to expect prolonged counterattacks lasting many hours or even days. By December 1944, the entire Japanese submarine force withdrew from Penang. The combination of Allied anti-submarine warfare, mining operations, and air attacks had made the base untenable. The submarine campaign in the Indian Ocean effectively ended. Not because the Japanese lacked submarines, not because they lacked crews willing to fight, but because the British and their Commonwealth allies had demonstrated that every attack would be answered with relentless pursuit. The specifications tell part of the story. The P-class destroyers were good ships, but not exceptional. Their Aztec equipment was standard issue, the same Type 144 sets found on dozens of escort vessels. Their depth charges were identical to those carried by corvettes and sloops. Their armament was adequate, not overwhelming. The American destroyer escorts operating in the Pacific carried more depth charges. American technology was arguably more advanced in some areas. American shipyards built escorts faster and in greater numbers. But Japanese submarine officers did not single out American equipment as particularly fearsome. They feared British persistence. This was not about hardware. This was about doctrine, training, and will. The Royal Navy had learned in the Atlantic that anti-submarine warfare was a war of attrition. The submarine that escaped today would kill tomorrow. The only solution was to never let go. That doctrine transferred to the Indian Ocean with the ships and crews that deployed there. Men like Commander RP had served in the Atlantic. They had seen what happened when submarines were allowed to escape. They brought that hard-won knowledge to the waters of Ceylon and the Mulaves. HMS Patard's crew had boarded a sinking U-boat to recover Enigma materials. They knew the stakes. They knew what submarine warfare meant for the merchant sailors and naval personnel who died by the thousands in torpedo attacks. When I-27 surfaced after sinking Cardivi's Mail, Patard did not simply attack and break off. She attacked and attacked and attacked through day and night, through exhaustion and dwindling ammunition until the submarine was destroyed. That is what Japanese submariners feared. Not any single weapon, not any technological advantage. The knowledge that British destroyers would not stop. The aftermath of the action brought recognition for both ships. Commander RP received the Distinguished Service Order for his determination and tactical skill throughout the prolonged engagement. Lieutenant Commander Gower received the Distinguished Service Cross for Paladin's crucial role in maintaining contact during the night hours and for her earlier rescue operations. The AIC operators, who had maintained contact through 30 hours of maneuvering, received commendations. Other crew members received decorations for their actions during the prolonged hunt. Petard's damage from the ramming required immediate attention. Her bow was crushed back for nearly 20 feet. Several forward compartments were flooded. She limped into Aduato for emergency repairs before proceeding to Colombo and eventually Bombay for dockyard work. The repairs took several weeks, but she returned to service and continued operations in the Indian Ocean for the remainder of the war. The story of Patard's boarding of U-559 in 1942 added another chapter to her legend. That operation had contributed to the breaking of German naval Enigma codes, saving countless lives in the Atlantic. Now she'd avenged over 200 deaths in the Indian Ocean. Few ships in the Royal Navy could claim such a distinguished record. HMS Paladin continued operations in the Indian Ocean, participating in further escort duties and supporting the eventual liberation of Burma. She provided gunfire support for amphibious operations along the Iraq coast and escorted convoys carrying the supplies that kept the 14th Army fighting. Her role in the S-27 hunt, maintaining contact through the night hours while Patard conducted attacks, was essential to the final outcome. Without Paladin's disciplined station keeping and accurate ASDIC work, the submarine might have escaped under cover of darkness. The Royal Indian Navy deserves particular mention in this broader campaign. Sloops like HMIS Godavari and HMIS Jum conducted extensive anti-submarine operations throughout the Bay of Bengal. HMIS Juna participated in the destruction of the Japanese submarine RO-110 in February 1944, working alongside Australian corvettes HMAS Ipswich and HMAS Launceston. This was the only confirmed Japanese submarine kill with direct Royal Indian Navy participation. HMIS Godavari achieved another notable success in August 1944, participating in the destruction of the German submarine U-198 near the Seychelles. The German boat had sunk 11 Allied ships totaling nearly 60,000 gross registered tons. Her destruction removed a serious threat from Indian Ocean waters. By the time of the Burma campaign's climax in 1945, the Royal Indian Navy had grown to over 25,000 personnel. Indian sailors served on escorts throughout the theater, contributing to the security of the convoy routes that supplied the 14th Army's advance. Australian forces also played crucial roles. The Royal Australian Navy provided corvettes and other vessels for Indian Ocean escort duties. Australian air crew flew anti-submarine patrols from bases in Ceylon and India. The campaign was truly a Commonwealth effort. The lessons of the 27 hunt resonated through the remainder of the war. Japanese submarine operations in the Indian Ocean never recovered. The few boats that remained operated with extreme caution, often aborting attacks rather than risk the prolonged hunts that had destroyed the 27 and others. Total Japanese submarine losses in the Indian Ocean reached approximately 12 boats during the war. British submarines operating from Ceylon accounted for most of these kills, using ultra-intelligence to intercept Japanese boats transiting the Strait of Malacca. But surface escorts like Patid and Paladin established the principle that attacking convoys meant potentially fatal consequences. The strategic impact extended beyond the submarine force itself. The security of Indian Ocean convoy routes allowed the buildup of forces that ultimately liberated Burma. The 14th Army supplies flowed through Kolkata and Chittagong. Without secure sea lanes, that campaign would have been impossible. British persistence developed through bitter experience in the Atlantic transferred successfully to the Indian Ocean theatre. The same crews, the same equipment, the same doctrine that had broken the U-boat threat proved equally effective against Japanese submarines operating thousands of miles from Germany's defeated wolf packs. Remember what Vice Admiral Mia said in his post-war interrogation? When asked what Allied tactic Japanese submariners feared most, he did not mention aircraft first, though he acknowledged their effectiveness. He did not mention radar, though he knew it had cost submarines. He specifically mentioned persistence, the knowledge that Allied ships would not stop hunting. February 12, 1944. HMS Pater detects a 27 after the sinking of Cardiff Ismail. Standard procedure would suggest a few hours of searching, then return to convoy protection. Instead, Patid and Paladin hunt for 30 hours straight through exhaustion, through darkness, through repeated surfacings and crash dives until they ram the submarine and sent her to the bottom with all hands. That is what persistence means. That is what Japanese submariners learned to fear. The women who died on Cardifism were avenged. Not through luck, not through superior technology, through the absolute refusal of 2 British destroyer crews to let their enemy escape. 1297 Dead demanded an answer. HMS Patid and HMS Paladin provided it. British destroyers in the Indian Ocean were never numerous. They were rarely the most modern ships in the fleet. Many were older vessels transferred from other theaters, their hulls weary from years of hard service, their machinery prone to breakdowns. But they carried crews who had learned in the hardest school of naval warfare that persistence was everything. The training those crews received in the Atlantic translated directly to the Indian Ocean. The tactics, the discipline, the sheer blood-minded determination to never let an enemy escape. These qualities were not accidents. They were the product of years of painful learning, of watching convoys slaughtered because escorts broke off too soon, of understanding that every submarine that escaped meant more ships torpedoed, more sailors drowned, more families grieving. Commander RP and his crew on Patid embodied this tradition. Lieutenant Commander Gower and Paladin's crew demonstrated it equally. 30 hours of continuous combat operations. Crews pushed beyond exhaustion. Equipment stressed to its limits. And at the end, a ramming attack that put their own ship at risk to ensure the enemy's destruction. That is what British persistence meant. That is what Japanese submariners learned to fear. The Japanese submarine force discovered this lesson at terrible cost. The Penang submarine base closed for good in late 1944. The boats that survived withdrew to Singapore and eventually to Japan. The Indian Ocean campaign was over. What remained was the record. British and Commonwealth forces had secured one of the most vital waterways on Earth. They had done it with limited resources, transferred ships, and crews exhausted from years of continuous warfare. They had done it through persistence. That quality, more than any weapon system, more than any technological advantage, defined British anti-submarine warfare in the Second World War, in the Atlantic against German U-boat, in the Mediterranean against Italian submarines, and in the Indian Ocean against Japanese fleet submarines that had terrorized shipping lanes for 2 years. HMS Patid's 30-hour hunt for a 27 stands as the defining example. When Japanese submarine officers spoke after the war about what they had feared, they described exactly what Patid's crew demonstrated. Ships that would not stop, crews that would not give up, a doctrine built on the understanding that the only acceptable outcome was the enemy's destruction. British persistence, the weapon that Japanese submariners feared more than anything else. But the hunt for his 27 was not the only time British ships demonstrated this relentless determination in Far Eastern waters. In the same month, other Royal Navy vessels were tracking Japanese submarines throughout the Bay of Bengal, developing the tactics and building the experience that would eventually drive enemy submarines from the Indian Ocean entirely. That campaign fought across thousands of miles of tropical ocean by exhausted crews on aging ships remains one of the least known chapters of the naval war. Yet, it secured the sea lanes that allowed the liberation of Burma and the ultimate defeat of Japan in Southeast Asia. The story of how British sloops and Indian Navy vessels hunted submarines in the Bay of Bengal follows similar themes of persistence against a determined enemy. But that is a story for another time. For now, consider this. 94 Japanese sailors died aboard a 27. 1,297 British and Commonwealth personnel died aboard Cardiff Ismail. The mathematics of submarine warfare in the Second World War were always brutal. But in the Indian Ocean, British persistence changed those mathematics. Submarines that attacked convoys faced destruction. The Japanese learned this lesson. They adjusted their tactics accordingly and ultimately they withdrew. That is what 2 destroyers accomplished in 30 hours of continuous combat. They demonstrated that the rules had changed, that British ships in the Indian Ocean would fight with the same determination that had broken the U-boat threat in the Atlantic. Japanese submariners feared many things. Aircraft with radar, mines in narrow straits, the slowly tightening noose of Allied dominance. But what they feared most was exactly what Commander Rupp and Lieutenant Commander Gower showed them on February 12 and 13, 1944. British persistence, relentless, exhausting, ultimately lethal. The weapon that no submarine could outrun.